After 12 years building everything, they turned me into an errand boy for the boss's son and told me I should feel honored. The sentence echoed in my head long after I left the glass-walled conference room. I walked into the elevator in silence, the folder still in my hand like a dead weight. Outside, Chicago gleamed under the bitter January sun. The sky was clear, but everything else had turned murky. Just like that, 12 years of grind, strategy, sacrifice. It all vanished in the space of a sentence. They didn't even blink. Douglas Clay looked me in the eye, calm as ever, and told me I'd be taking on a transitional role to help Brandon grow into a leadership position. No mention of Westover, no thanks for landing the biggest contract of the year. Just a quiet burial. Brandon strolled into that morning meeting 5 minutes late, coffee in hand, nodding like he owned the place. And now, maybe he did. He took my seat at the head of the table like it had always been his. Nobody stopped him. The others, the VPs, the managers I'd mentored, just shifted their eyes. I was told to support his onboarding, which apparently included building his presentation decks and managing his calendar. That's what they handed me after a decade of late nights, budget wars, and cross-continental deals. A glorified assistant job under a kid who'd never handled a live client without stumbling. When I got home that night, something felt off. I couldn't let it go. I opened the metadata on the reassignment letter. It was created 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. They knew. Before I even signed the final Westover contract. Before the press photos. Before the champagne. All the while, they smiled at me, toasted with me, slapped me on the back, knowing full well they were waiting to pull the rug out. I looked back at the moments that suddenly felt staged, the way Douglas avoided eye contact during the last board call, how Brandon had started showing up to my client briefings just to observe. I didn't want to believe it then. Now I had no choice. Later that night, Brandon sent me a message. Don't forget to prep Monday's decks. Let's make sure you're aligned with my style. That line stuck with me. My style. He didn't even have one. What he had was a last name, a father who needed to keep his legacy in the family, and a system that allowed him to walk over people like me because it was easier than rewarding merit. They didn't demote me because I failed. They demoted me because I succeeded too well. They handed me a knife with a smile, asked me to applaud as they slid it between my ribs. And I did. Until now. I sat in the driver's seat long after the engine cut. Silence wrapped around me like fog. No anger. Not yet. Just a blank space where something used to live. Trust, maybe. Loyalty. Purpose. I didn't know what would fill it yet. But I knew it wouldn't be another PowerPoint for Brandon. They didn't break me. They revealed themselves. And now I had a decision to make. I wasn't done. Not yet. Not by a long shot. They didn't kill my career overnight. They starved it slowly, until I was too numb to scream. It wasn't just the demotion. It was what came after. The slow, deliberate dismantling. First, I was cut out of the weekly senior briefings. Streamlining. Then the strategy pipeline was moved under Brandon's direct review. Fresh perspective. Even the intern I'd personally recruited now reported to him. I kept my head down, played the role, tracked every shift. And I started keeping records. Screenshots, timestamps, emails, whispers in the hallway. Not for revenge, at least not yet. For clarity. I needed to understand how far this went. Who knew? Who stood by? Who sharpened the knife? The more I watched, the more patterns surfaced. Brandon wasn't just incompetent. He was reckless. He approved vendor deals without legal review, rerouted freight contracts to friends of friends, inflated early projections to the board with no real numbers behind them. He wasn't leading. He was playing pretend CEO, and Douglas let him. That was the part I couldn't shake. Douglas had once told me, "In this business, you back results, not names." I believed him. I built this company on that belief. But somewhere along the line, he changed. Or maybe I was blind to who he'd always been. The turning point came on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the reassignment. I got an anonymous internal file slipped into my inbox. No subject line, just a link to a shared drive. Inside, a full audit trail of Brandon overriding 3 supply chain compliance rules, one of which had caused a failed delivery that cost us a 7-figure account. The kicker? Douglas had marked it addressed internally and closed the file. No escalation. No penalty. Just buried. That was when I knew this wasn't a test. It wasn't temporary. I wasn't coming back. They weren't waiting for me to prove my value. They were phasing me out and keeping my silence with a paycheck. But they'd miscalculated. I didn't care about the title anymore. I cared about the truth. I made a copy of that file. Then I made more. Financial inconsistencies. HR complaints that went nowhere. A whole system of protection wrapped around one last name. I started calling people who owed me favors, quietly. Lisa Grant, ex-regional lead, shoved out a year ago for poor cultural fit, right after she questioned Brandon's forecast numbers. Dominic Rowe, procurement VP at Halcyon, who once told me, "If Ashgate ever burns, I want front row seats." They weren't hard to find. People remembered. People watched. All they needed was a reason to speak. I was going to give them one. I didn't know yet what my endgame looked like. But I knew this. Brandon was building a tower out of kindling. All I had to do was find the right match. Disappearing wasn't defeat. It was preparation. 2 weeks after I turned in my resignation letter, no one called. No one asked why. Not even Douglas. It told me everything I needed to know. I was disposable, until I wasn't. I vanished from the company's radar, cut ties clean, left the exit interview blank. Let them think I was broken, bitter, burned out. Meanwhile, I was building. Not a resume, a blueprint. I'd rented a desk in a small co-working space off West Belmont, next to a startup that sold AI-based warehouse tools. The kind of place where nobody asked questions, and the Wi-Fi ran better than the HVAC. I started contacting every supply chain contact I trusted. People who had been pushed aside, underpaid, shut out by Ashgate's expansion. I didn't promise them revenge. I promised a better alternative. I called it Northway. No logo. No website. Just a core platform idea and a model that fixed the exact things Brandon kept screwing up. More transparency, predictive logistics, incentives for accuracy over volume. Within a month, I had a team of 4, Lisa included. She had documents, memos, client-side complaints that had been silenced or redirected. Together, we mapped out every gap Ashgate had created by trying to scale too fast under Brandon's mismanagement. I didn't have investors. I didn't need them. I had information. And I had names. People who hated Brandon more than I did, and would move contracts if they had an excuse. The trick wasn't to destroy Ashgate. The trick was to make them irrelevant in the exact space they dominated. I focused on mid-size B to B clients, the ones Ashgate had deprioritized chasing enterprise expansion. I didn't outbid Ashgate. I outthought them. Tailored contracts, dedicated logistics advisors, faster onboarding. Every client I pulled had a story. Wrong invoice, delayed shipment, calls unanswered. I was the answer to a problem Ashgate didn't admit existed. By the time Douglas noticed, the damage would already be measurable. But I needed one more thing. Credibility. That's where Dominic came in. He still sat on 2 regional distribution councils. If Northway passed his audit, others would follow. I handed him everything. Real-time routing prototypes, pilot metrics, the entire business plan. He looked it over, dead silent, then said, "You're serious about this?" I nodded once. "Good, because they're starting to panic." He pulled out his phone, a forwarded email from Ashgate. They wanted to fast-track an emergency proposal to patch B2B churn in Q3. I recognized the phrasing. It was mine. A line from a deck I'd written 8 months ago, recycled, stripped of context, desperate. I smiled for the first time in weeks. They thought I was gone. They didn't know I was already inside the walls. I didn't fire the first shot. I just made sure they heard it loud. Halcyon's withdrawal from Ashgate hit like a thunderclap. The email came in on a Monday morning, a formal notice terminating all contracts by the end of Q2. No explanation, just legal precision. Douglas must have stared at that line for hours. By the time Brandon stormed into his office, half the board had already seen it. I know, because one of them forwarded me the internal scramble. Subject line: urgent. What's going on with Halcyon? I didn't send the message. I didn't need to. Dominic had made the move. After 3 weeks of vetting our platform, he'd flipped. Quietly. Completely. He didn't just pull Halcyon. He took 2 regional co-suppliers with him. In less than 48 hours, Ashgate's projected Q3 margin took a 6% hit. They didn't know where the leak was coming from. That was the point. Northway didn't show up on radar. We didn't run ads. We didn't pitch VCs. We didn't even issue an LLC press release. Just cold contracts, real logistics, and clean execution. That was the bait. The real blow came when Lisa dropped the white paper. Anonymous authorship. Circulated through LinkedIn channels and supply chain forums. It outlined inefficiencies in Ashgate's B2B scaling model, complete with anonymized case studies and predictive failure curves. She buried it with technical jargon, just enough for anyone in the field to recognize the patterns. It wasn't an attack. It was a mirror, and it spread like gasoline on dry leaves. Suddenly, Ashgate wasn't the rising star. It was the company that used to get it right. I sat back and watched the narrative twist without ever touching it. That was the beauty of silence. It made noise when used well. Brandon tried damage control, a press dinner, a podcast interview. But every word sounded like spin. He started showing up to meetings he used to skip, barking orders without listening. His panic made him sloppy. One morning, he fired the compliance team lead for non-alignment. That same afternoon, 3 compliance reports leaked to clients, reports showing Brandon had overruled logistics protocols for speed. Clients don't care about charisma, they care about delivery. And Ashgate was late, repeatedly. The cracks were visible. I didn't widen them, I just let the pressure do its job. Meanwhile, Northway added 2 more clients, both former Ashgate accounts. One even reused the same service template I had written, back when I was still wearing their badge. The irony wasn't lost on me. And yet, I wasn't done. I had one more move, one that would make it clear this wasn't a revenge play. This was an evolution. I reached out to an old contact at the Tribune, not for a hit piece, but for a trend story. Small firms filling gaps left by overgrown giants. No names, just data. A chart showing the slow shift in B2B logistics towards specialized networks. Northway was mentioned once, buried in the middle. That's all I needed. A whisper, not a shout. But it reached them. The morning it ran, Brandon called a closed-door meeting. We need to find out who's leaking. He didn't know the leak wasn't in his walls. It was in his mirror, his own actions, recorded, replayed, reinterpreted. Douglas started digging. He pulled audit logs, checked chat archives. Still nothing. Because I'd never touched their systems. I didn't have to. I'd been one of them long enough to know how they moved, who they trusted, what they ignored. I wasn't attacking Ashgate. I was replacing it. Quietly. Efficiently. with everything it forgot to be. Brandon's voice was rising now, sharp, defensive, unsure. That wasn't the tone of a man in control. It was the tone of someone realizing the kingdom wasn't his, just borrowed, just dressed up in entitlement. I didn't need to take his place. I just needed to take away the illusion that it belonged to him. And the next call I made would do exactly that. They were searching for a traitor inside the company. They didn't realize I was already out. The call I placed that morning wasn't to a journalist or a client. It was to the one person Brandon never saw coming, Ashgate's largest private investor, Monica Vale. She controlled nearly 11% of voting shares and had never spoken a word to Brandon directly. Not once. I knew because I used to be her point of contact. Back then, I updated her quarterly, answered questions, calmed nerves. When she stopped returning Brandon's emails 3 months ago, he chalked it up to strategic distance. It wasn't. She was watching, waiting. And when I called, she answered on the second ring. "It's about time," she said. We met the next morning in a corner booth at a quiet cafe in Evanston. No lawyers, no advisors, just two people who knew exactly how this industry worked. I showed her everything, not just the audit trail and leaked reports. She'd seen most of that already. What she hadn't seen was the roadmap, Northway's projected expansion, client retention curve, operational margin forecast. Every number lined up against Ashgate's. She didn't blink. "You're not trying to take them down," she said, flipping through the summary. "You're trying to make them obsolete." I didn't deny it. I didn't have to. She closed the folder. "I'll need access to your back end." "Done," I said. 3 hours later, her advisory office issued a formal request for board review of Ashgate's Q3 and Q4 reporting. Not a scandal, a question, but one with teeth, the kind that drew attention. Internal panic surged immediately. Brandon tried to spin it as a targeted political move. Douglas, for once, stayed quiet. I heard through Dominic that several board members began requesting full financial transparency, something Brandon couldn't provide. He'd fudged too many metrics, deleted too many Slack threads, ignored too many quiet warnings. And Monica wasn't alone anymore. Other investors started circling. They didn't care about revenge. They cared about risk. I was risk mitigation now, an option, a name that came up in side meetings. What if he came back? I wasn't interested in returning, but I let the rumor grow. Let it make Brandon sweat. Meanwhile, Northway finalized our 5th client transition, another defection from Ashgate's mid-tier book. Every new contract was faster, smoother, cleaner. The press hadn't caught on yet, but insiders had. Job applicants doubled in 2 weeks. One resume stood out. Rita Chen, former Ashgate compliance officer. Fired for irreconcilable values. She attached no cover letter, just 3 bullet points, audit chain, time stamps, and a hidden folder link. The contents? Damning. Proof that Brandon had personally signed off on data overrides. And more than that, proof Douglas had known. I didn't celebrate. I just cataloged and sent a single encrypted file to Monica with the subject, "Final clarity." She replied with one line, "Understood." By Friday, Ashgate's stock dropped 6%. Not from headlines, from whispers, quiet exits, meetings canceled, confidence bleeding. And the board called for a closed session with one item on the agenda, review of executive conduct. Brandon never saw it coming. He was too busy barking orders, too busy hunting phantoms, too busy blaming the walls for what the mirror refused to show. And I was already moving forward. I didn't need to be in the room when it happened. I just needed one more message. Power doesn't vanish. It transfers, quietly, permanently. The final message came on a Tuesday morning, 7:12 a.m., from an unknown number. 3 words. It's happening today. No name. No need. I closed the notification without replying. By then, I already knew what it meant. The board had moved. Monica had tipped the balance, and Brandon was walking into a room where his last name didn't shield him anymore. I didn't dress up, didn't go in. I went for a run instead, first time in months. Air was cold, sharp enough to sting. I needed it. Needed to feel what it was like to move again, to breathe without calculating my next 5 steps. For weeks, everything had been pressure, surveillance, precision. This was release. When I got back, my inbox held the confirmation. An internal statement from Ashgate's legal office. Brandon Clay, effective immediately, was no longer affiliated with the company. No explanation. Just a surgical cut. The press would call it a transition. Insiders would call it a purge. Either way, he was done. But what caught my eye wasn't Brandon's name. It was Douglas. No signature. No quote. No presence. That was his message. Disappear before the fire reaches your chair. I wondered how long he'd last. Hours, maybe. Days if he begged. But I wasn't watching anymore. I had a full calendar. Northway had just onboarded our 6th client. Real logistics, real contracts. No politics. My team was lean, sharp, and loyal, not out of obligation, but because we'd all been pushed out of something we once built. They didn't follow me because I was loud. They followed because I listened. Because I remembered. I spent that afternoon finalizing a joint platform deal with Halcyon and 2 other mid-sized players. Independent nodes forming something new, agile, dangerous. Something Ashgate couldn't pivot fast enough to fight. It was done. The system that fed off names and boardroom lineage had blinked, and in that moment, we moved in. I didn't raise a glass, didn't post a quote or write a blog about triumph. I just sat in that co-working chair, sipped lukewarm coffee, and stared out the window at a city that hadn't noticed what we'd done underneath its skin. But I knew. And I knew it was only the beginning. Because when you build something with clean hands, you don't need applause. Just results. The empire that once stood untouchable fell without a single headline, only the sound of silence growing louder each day. What began as betrayal ended with precision, not vengeance. Justice delivered in whispers, not war. Because sometimes, the most powerful statement is choosing to build instead of destroy. Like the final chord of a long-forgotten melody, justice may arrive late, but it resonates powerfully once it's heard. And in that quiet reckoning, the truth always finds a way to speak.